Welcome. Today's reading, John Locke's Express and Tacit Consent. This begins on page 59 and ends on 61 of Political Thought, Oxford Reader. And Locke here begins with a thought we've already seen expressed by Thomas Hobbes. Men being, as has been said, by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one. The independent part, boy, Karl Marx, I'm sure would take issue with that. Where are you pulling that from, John Locke? Certainly not from an understanding of human anthropology or history. Nonetheless, in this state of nature, there is freedom, as Hobbes puts it, natural liberty. There's equality. Apparently, there's independence. I guess in this sense, the idea is something like in a state of nature, you can't rely on others. You can't be dependent on them to satisfy your own needs. No one, Locke says, can be put out of this estate and subjected to the political power of another without his own consent, which is done. Now, of course, they can, right? They just can't legitimately, I think is what Locke means here. Clearly they can, right? You can be captured in war, enslaved, etc. at this time. However, this would not be legitimate. It would just be domination. It would be barbarism or something like this. Okay, so we need to have consent then for subjection to political power. What legitimates political power? The consent of the governed. This is where that thought comes from. And this consent is done by agreeing with other men to join and unite into a community for their comfortable, safe, and peaceable living, one amongst another in a secure enjoyment of their properties, that is, the things they own, and a greater security against any that are not of it. So, security from enemies, foreign primarily here, rivals, other communities on the borders and fringes of this nation, etc. For, as he puts it in the second paragraph, when any number of men have, by the consent of every individual, made a community, they have thereby made that community one body, with a power to act as one body. Hobbes is in perfect agreement here. This is what he's kind of imagining, right? In the depiction of Leviathan, this sort of giant biblical monster that he compares the institution of political government to, you know, in the frontispiece, the image that originally went in the book, back in the 1600s, you have the image of a giant figure with a sort of scepter, perhaps, and a crown. I can't remember the details, right? But a giant sort of sovereign. When you look closely, the sovereign is composed of innumerable, really, tiny little human beings. The idea is something like all of us small, little human beings in a state of nature, all come together and form one powerful giant body. Power to act as one body, and this occurs through the will and determination of the majority. For that which acts any community, being only the consent of the individuals of it, and it being one body, must move one way, right? So anything that is going to be active, any kind of government that's going to do things, needs to move in one way, even if it has many, many members, right? So majority rule is how to get this effective movement. Establish laws, enforce those laws, figure out how to enforce them, carry that out, implement laws, and the body here is going to be moved whichever way the greater force carries it, is what Locke is saying. So he's basically making a case here for majority rule. Government must be effective, it must do things, it must make things happen, and we cannot expect, I guess what he's getting at here is we can't expect perfect consensus, we can't expect complete and total agreement, so majority rule is the way to make this kind of government effective. But the question remains, how do people exactly consent to this kind of government? So if you look towards the bottom of page 59, this is the paragraph, not the last paragraph, but the one just before that, the beginning of the penultimate paragraph on page 59. John Locke writes, "Thus every man, by consenting with others to make one body politic under one government, puts himself under an obligation to every one of that society to submit to the determination of the majority and to be concluded by it." So, people come together. They agree together to form one sort of unified government, and at the same time, they agree to submit, right, and to be obligated by that government to submit to the determinations of the majority. So whatever the majority decides, I will do it. I will go along with it, even if it's not what I want. And to be concluded by it. So this is how this works, right? We are going to consent to establish this powerful agency that we're calling government. It will be moved into action by votes in which the majority decides, and we all agree, whether, however we're going to come out in these various votes, whether we're with the majority party or the minority party, we are going to agree to be obliged and to submit ourselves to this government. Now, why? Why majority rule and not universal consensus? Well, I've already suggested, right? Universal consensus, Locke is going to claim is impractical. If you look at the very bottom of page 59, first sentence, he says, "If the consent of the majority shall not in reason be received as the act of the whole, and conclude every individual." So in other words, if we're not going to go with majority consent, but require universal consent, that everybody say yes before we do anything, or no before we decide not to do it, well, the problem then, Locke says on the bottom of 59, is that nothing but the consent of every individual can make anything to be the act of the whole, which, considering the infirmities of health and the advocations of business, which in a number, though much less that of a commonwealth, will necessarily keep many away from the public assembly. So in other words, first of all, we're not going to be able to even get everyone together to vote, let alone to agree. I mean, this is even a problem with representative government. You don't often have every congressman or senator in the United States even present for every vote. So I think what Locke is pointing out here is, boy, we can't even get universal participation with representative government. You would never be able to get it with a direct democracy or something like this. Also, he says, the variety of opinions and contrariety of interests, opposed interests, which unavoidably happen in all collections of men, it is pretty much impossible, right? People have different opinions, people have different interests, people are busy and sometimes have other engagements, conflicts in their scheduling, and this means it will be impossible to ever get something like universal consent. And he says, and therefore, if coming into society be upon such terms that require universal explicit consent, it will only be like Cato's coming into the theater, tantum ut exiret. Apparently Cato went to the theater one day just so that he could leave the theater. Hello, I must be going. He shows up perhaps at the end of the show and then leaves. Now, so obviously, right, explicit, universal consent is impractical. We cannot expect this. This is Locke setting up his case now for how it's tacit consent that actually legitimizes political government. And it can only be tacit consent because, again, express, explicit, universal consent, just not possible, not practical. So, on the middle page 60, he says, that which begins and actually constitutes any political society is nothing but the consent of any number of free men capable of majorities. You must have a majority of citizens to unite and incorporate into such a society. This is that and that only which did or could give beginning to any lawful government in the world. But now, we have to talk more about that consent, right? What is understood to be a sufficient declaration of a man's consent to make him subject to the laws of government? In the middle of page 60. This is the question. Why? Well, if we can clearly explain how humans tacitly consent to their government, then we can have a justification for the legitimacy of that government, even without something like a signed document in which everybody has signed their name and said they are okay with this government and with submitting to it, or where they have explicitly voted or affirmed or taken an oath to swear something like their allegiance. This is something that, for instance, today in the United States is required of people who are becoming citizens. You must take an oath, right? You must study U.S. history and the Constitution a little bit or something like this and take an oath. That's not required of people who are born in this country as natural citizens. And so then the question becomes, when have I ever, as a natural citizen, somebody born in this country and raised here, when have I ever explicitly consented to this government? And the answer is never. So then this is why Locke must show, right? You don't have to explicitly consent. We didn't need your signature. You didn't need to actually explicitly vote. All you ever needed to do was tacitly consent. So, as he puts it, there's a common distinction of an express and tacit consent which will concern our present case. Middle of page 60 towards the bottom. He says, the problem, the difficulty, is what ought to be looked upon as tacit consent and how far it binds. I mean, if it's not something we ever expressly, explicitly, openly, and literally do in a clear and direct manner, how can we be sure it's ever actually happened at all? Right? So how do we know whether or not people have tacitly consented and thereby submitted to any government where we have people that have made no expressions of it at all? Here is Locke's answer. Hobbes is in agreement. Many social contract thinkers would be in agreement, and you find versions of this kind of reasoning to this day. Every man that hath any possession or enjoyment of any part of the dominions of any government doth hereby give his tacit consent. So if you own anything, if you live somewhere, you have tacitly consented to the government in that region. Possession of property, enjoyment of resources, enjoyment of the fruits of some property. These are indications of tacit consent. To the extent then that we have any property or we enjoy life in any region of the world, we are obliged to obey the laws of that government. Now, so again, possession of property, enjoyment of life. Now he says, whether this be possession of land or lodging only for a week. So if you're staying in a hotel, staying in an inn or a tavern at this time, even if you're just visiting, right? The very fact you're staying there, you're enjoying the comforts of life, you're enjoying some activity you're doing there, whether it be barely traveling freely on the highway. Even here, the idea is something like, maybe you're just passing through, literally, just driving through. You're driving from Mexico to Canada or something like this, passing through the United States. What Locke is pointing out is, while in the United States, and even if you're just on the roads from Mexico to Canada, you come in Tijuana, and your destination is Vancouver. His claim here is, nobody has to sort of make you swear an oath upon entry into the United States that you will obey the laws of the United States until you leave. Instead, the idea is something like, simply by virtue of coming over from Tijuana into San Diego and through California, Oregon, and Washington into British Columbia, simply traveling on the freeway and enjoying the ability to travel on that freeway and get from point A to point B obliges you to obey the laws of the country that you're in and the states that you're in the case of the United States. And this is just something as simple as, hey, there might be one speed limit in Tijuana, and then there's a different speed limit around San Diego, and then there could even be a different speed limit in Oregon or Washington, and then there's going to be different rules of the road, basically, or slight variations, whether you're in Canada, Mexico, or the United States. And the idea is something like this: if you're in Mexico, then you should be obeying the rules of the road that are established there. And if you're in the United States, you're obligated to obey the rules of the road while traveling the highways here. And if you get to Canada, you must obey those rules of the road, right? You can't tell the Mexican police officer, well, I'm doing what is allowed in Canada. That's not going to work down in Tijuana. And likewise, you don't get to tell the Canadian police officer in Vancouver who pulls you over for, whatever, well, this was perfectly fine when I was, in Portland, Oregon. So you have tacitly consented to obey the laws of a government, even if you're just doing something as simple as traveling freely on the highway. So, in a nutshell then, this is what Locke means by tacit consent. And let's just look at his concluding passage on the bottom of page 61. He writes, "Thus we see that foreigners, by living all their lives under another government and enjoying the privileges and protection of it, though they are bound, even in conscience, to submit to its administration as far forth as any denizen, yet do not thereby come to be subjects or members of that commonwealth. Nothing can make any man so but is actually entering into it by positive engagement and express promise and compact interest in." So I guess what he's getting at here is you can be a resident alien or a foreigner living in a foreign country, um, and you can tacitly consent to obeying the laws of that country. But if you seek to become a citizen or member, subject or member of the Commonwealth, this can't be done through tacit consent. This, becoming a citizen, apparently requires express promise and compact. So, an interesting little distinction there at the end. Plenty of ways we can apply these thoughts to the present day for sorting out the current absolute disaster that is the U.S. immigration system. But we simply do not have the time to get into that in detail today. That will suffice for our discussion of John Locke on express and tacit consent. I will talk to you soon again.